Welcome, good afternoon to Australian comics and their creators, this miraculous panel of artists. ACMI acknowledges the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation on whose land we meet today. We share and work on this land. We pay our respects to elders past and present and extend respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people from all nations of this land. I'm going to hand to Liam Burke.
Yeah, thanks very much, Ewan, and thanks to ACMI for everything they've done over the past few days. I think we were going to show a short clip before we begin, so I'll just wait for that for a minute.
Australian superheroes. I think that'd be different. That'd be cool.
We definitely need more Australian superheroes, I reckon.
Do I think there are enough Australian superheroes? Probably not, because I can't think of any.
I don't know if there are any Australian superheroes. I mean, obviously we got Thor, but he's not exactly Australian.
I know there've been a few out there, but they don't get it. They don't get the same kind of exposure as the American superheroes do.
I'd like to see a few Australian superheroes for a laugh.
I don't know, maybe a guy dressed up as a kangaroo or something.
Like a normal superhero, I guess, but maybe with a bit more of a relaxed attitude.
Maybe, you know, Speedo Man or something like that.
Like use crocodiles as his power or something. That'd be pretty cool.
Unless you wanted like a Captain Bogan. Nah, let's just leave it to the big boys, shall we?
Our superheroes are like Mad Max. When I think of an Australian superhero, I don't think of someone wearing spandex. That's a really American image to me.
The whole world, according to the internet, says that Australia is one of the most dangerous places in the world and everything's trying to kill you. So it's the perfect place for a superhero, really.
Every Aussie has grown up with like snakes and spiders and all of these kind of threats that make the natural world very real.
I think Australia probably produces more villains than heroes because we're kind of rough, nurturing country.
We've got a lot of great storytellers. We've got great history as a country in itself, as a culture in itself to create things. And I think the importance now is that these characters need to start being created by Australian people.
There aren't enough Australian superheroes and there definitely should be more. Like I wrote one injustice story that happened in Melbourne. We had the Flash running past Flinders Street Station.
It's also good to be able to see a guy on screen and go, oh yeah, he's from Melbourne, and he can actually relate to the guy that's on the screen.
I was always disappointed because I never had a role model that I could look up to that was like Aussie. And now we have these little kids that are coming to this convention just to see me because there's an Aussie hero, you know, which is amazing. It's amazing. We need more of it.
So hi everyone, I'm Liam Burke. I'm the Cinema and Screen Studies Coordinator at Swinburne University of Technology and one of the organisers of this Superheroes Beyond conference. And that clip just points to one of the outcomes of the project. And while you're here at ACMI, we do hope that you take a look at the Cleverman exhibition that will run here till late April, obviously about the ABC show, as well as the Sutu illustrated VR experience in Screen Worlds, which is Superheroes Realities Collide. And that is a VR version of downtown Melbourne, but comic book-fied. And you get to become a superhero and fly around and, you know, breathe ice breath onto trams and do all sorts of funky things. So make sure to check that out, and good on you, Sutu, for doing that. So the idea of this panel is it's not specific to superheroes, but obviously, you know, they're sort of the spandex-clad elephant in the room. But what I'll briefly do is introduce I think most of you know our panelists, and then we'll kick off with some questions. So on my right, starting here is Nicholas Scott, who you would recognize as the artist of Wonder Woman and most recently Black Magic. Then Wolfgang Bilsma, who is the editor-in-chief of Gestalt Publishing, where a lot of these guys have published books in the past, and probably most recently and most relevantly to this particular event is the co-writer and publisher of the Cleverman tie-in comic. Then right there down is Tom Taylor, next to Wolf, and Tom is the writer of, amongst other books, X-Men Red, Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, The Deep, and a whole range of other books that we're going to get to. And at the end of the line there, we have Sutu, who we've already mentioned, who is started off as a comic book creator, but has really moved into the VR and interactive space, producing books like Neomad and Nulls, but most recently, and again most relevantly, probably the Superheroes Realities Collide VR experience. So join me in welcoming our very good panel. I might move out slightly so I can see you guys a little better. So let's start with comics. Why comics? Given all the other media and opportunities that are available, what can comics do that other media can't? What are the unique storytelling opportunities?
You're just opening this up to all of us.
Let's start with Nicola. We'll work down the line, and hopefully then you'll interrupt each other as you go.
Thanks. Well, the reason why I decided to draw comics wasn't particularly creative to start off with. I just wanted to get paid to draw Wonder Woman. That was kind of my... I was looking for something that I could do with drawing that I could make a living out of. And when it occurred to me that that's a real job, getting paid to draw Wonder Woman, I was like, right, I want to do that, because I already draw her all the time for my own amusement, and I want someone else to pay me to do it. And that sort of started my comic book education, because I hadn't really grown up with comic books, but I had grown up with superheroes. But what I found along the way, as I was kind of building my career, and certainly the deeper into it that I became, was not only the unique opportunities that you can do with comic books that you can't necessarily do, but it was the amount of control that you can have over it. Because, film and TV are incredible sort of storytelling devices, but you're generally, unless you're the director, you're one of a giant team of people putting everything together, and you're working kind of in committee under the direction and the inspiration of whoever's in charge, whether it be the producer or the director. Where in comics, it's a little team. It's just a writer and an artist and a little sort of support team around them. And you can do anything. There's no budget. There's no limit. You can tell tiny little intimate stories with very simple line work, or you can go batshit crazy and intergalactic and massive budget with thousands of, swarms of armies and all kinds of craziness. And all it takes is just a little more time to draw it.
Wolfgang, would you concur? Is that your experience? You are both the writer and publisher. I mean, I was a publisher all the time, but co-writer sometimes. Has that been your experience too?
Well, I was initially just going to say I absolutely agree with Nicola, but then she started talking about Wonder Woman, and I couldn't call on that experience from my past. But everything else that Nicola has said is absolutely true. The idea of comics being able to blend this unique synthesis of two of my passions, the literary and the visual disciplines, into one single language, where you have such, I guess, liberty to play with timing, especially. You can choose your moments that you portray in each comic panel very carefully, and imply so much in the gutters that the control over that, as well as being able to control the creative process, because it is such a small team ordinarily. And in my experience, we were talking about 1, 2, 3 people teams at most.
Yeah.
That there's just such liberty in that, and being true to the creative expression.
And then, Tom, I suppose as the writer, you have to place a lot of faith in the hands of the artist. You might say it needs to look like this, but is there how does that relationship work?
It's different artist to artist. I've been fortunate enough to work with Nicola on a thing, and we literally had someone drop the Washington Monument on the White House. So the first thing I'll say is that comics can be quite cathartic.
Let's do it again.
Talk to each other and email and and say, Nick, we're doing this. And she's like, what? And we're like, right, crazy. Yeah, no, really, Superman's going to burn Jonathan Kent to death at the dinner table. Yeah.
That'll be fun.
Yeah. Anyway. But yeah, no, for me, I mean, comics are the greatest storytelling medium in the world. I say this all the time, but it's true. There's nothing I like more. Wolf was talking about the liberty of it. There's nothing more freeing creatively. You know, I've written for screen, I've written for theatre, the rest of it, you know, I'm not confined to a stage. I'm not confined to a budget. There's not notes coming from Germany and France and Canada and Australia and saying, no, we can't because we can't model that rock. Comics is everything. It makes me very happy. And I also get to play with the greatest toys in the world. I think that's a really big part of it for me. You know, I've got an X-Men comic coming out next week and a Batman comic. And it's like, that's cool. Little kid Tommy's like, nice one. Yeah.
And Sutu, then in some of your comics, you've sort of embraced the biggest team possible. We were talking about Neomad earlier, where I think in the end you had about 50 collaborators. Maybe tell people a little bit about that your collaborators on that project.
Yeah, so like I don't come from a traditional comics background. I grew up in a remote part of Tasmania reading websites, and so I kind of navigated towards the web as the space that I would present my stories. I loved drawing my whole life, and then just like, oh cool, I can put my drawings onto a website. But I also like this opportunity to be able to kind of take a hyperlink from one website to the next, you know, read some text, see an image, maybe play a video or hear an audio bite, and that concept of being able to access all that media into a narrative that you choose by sort of clicking through was kind of what conjured up this interactive webcomic format for me, which I've sort of evolved over the last decade. And the Neomad project has been my most sort of beloved project. I had the opportunity to work with the Indigenous community up in northern Western Australia, particularly kids between the age of 9 to 12. And yeah, I kind of pitched it to them, like, you know, do you want to do a story, and what kind of story? And it was this kind of like a little bit like a role-playing game or something where we take on a role. I was like, okay, well, you're going to be a character. Who's your character going to be? But we'd really get into it. Like, I'd have a big box of clothes there, and they'd put the clothes on and paint their faces and stuff, and then I'd draw a sketch of them, and, oh, what's your character's name going to be? And I was like, okay, when is this story set? Oh, what kind of movies do you like? They're like, everyone's like action and crazy sci-fi and stuff like that. Okay, let's do that. And then so through that process and their responses, like I'd throw a scenario out at them, like, oh, you know, we're walking onto this bit of country, but there's a security robot there. What are you going to do? And they'll be like, oh, shoot it down with my slingshot. I was like, oh, but you missed. And it's like, the little guy next to him is like, but I got one. And then he'll shoot it. I was like, but they were saying it in their own little vernacular. So it's like a super fun way to get some authentic language into the storytelling as well. But by the end of it, like we did the first episode with 14 kids, the second episode, the 14 kids were all boys in the first episode, and then the girls came up to me and had a meeting, and they were like, we're going to have our own gang. And so suddenly it grew to 25 kids. And then by the end, we had 50 members from the community, including like about 6 grandmas in the story. I drew them in, and then... But the beautiful thing was presented as an iPad comic, so when you tapped on the speech bubbles, you'd hear their voices. So a big point of it was like to just make sure that people realised that there were real humans behind these characters.
And that's one of the interesting things about your interactive comics is you have those sound bites and those animations built into it. But of course Neomad, which is available in the ACMI bookstore, is also a print comic published by Gestalt. So Wolfgang, as a publisher, how do you wrestle with all the new possibilities that are available to you, but you know, still kind of maintaining comics not bleeding into becoming something that's animation or something else different? How do you wrestle with all that? Digital age.
It's very easy because I have such limited resources. I can't wrestle with everything at the same time. You know, it becomes more about, for me, the approach of trying to make content available to audiences however they want it. So if I can get something out, you know, as a print comic and meet traditional readership, that's great, and it may open their eyes to what's available digitally or in interactive medium. You know, in terms of, it's like the argument of whether print or digital sales are more important. It doesn't matter as long as people are finding their way to it.
Mm. And then one of the comics that's been a great success for Gestalt and also for Tom is The Deep, which is now not just a comic, but kind of a transmedia franchise with 3 seasons on Netflix of the animated series. How do you guys, and everyone can probably talk to this, deal with the kind of the possibility that something might be adapted and kind of making sure that it works as a comic first, but still has the potential perhaps for some of those sort of transmedia extensions?
Well, from Gestalt's approach and from my own personal approach, it just became a matter of making sure the story was solid. You know, it's not a matter of looking at what could we on-sell for later adaptation. It's more, you know, does this hold together? Is there substance to it? Does it have a resonance? You know, and if it brings all those bells, then I'm more interested in working on it, regardless of whether or not it has grand commercial capability later on. I think one of the benefits of that approach is that people saw that in The Deep and also saw the potential for it to be adapted. Slightly because of that, slightly because they may have been looking at it with slightly different eyes in terms of what it could mean commercially to them as well. So the integrity of the storytelling was first and foremost, but then if they saw a way of getting a greater audience to it through animation and now through merchandise and other things that are on the way, then yeah, that's fantastic.
What about you, Tom?
Look, yeah, for me, comics are my first love, so I wanted to tell tell a great story, and getting someone like James Brower, who can turn this world into something unbelievably appealing to everybody, was a huge part of it. But I will contradict Wolf slightly, because we did the logo and the masthead and stuff very early on, and we were talking at the time, because we could see, I believe we could see the possibility of it, and we knew we wanted it to go further, and so we did talk about how the logo would look on a lunchbox and t-shirts. Yep. Which now exist, but yes, nobody knows yet. We were seeing the t-shirts last night. So exciting!
I'd say we had we had little expectation, or rather, I had little expectation.
I had lots.
Such a pessimist, Wolf.
Yeah, right.
Pragmatist.
Okay.
Sure. But the life it's had, and I will say too, these are Australian comics. This is an Australian family that comes from an Australian storytelling POV. They're out there, and it came from Australia. So I would say they're Australian heroes, even though it's the most watched show in the UK. So people all around the world identify with it in different ways.
But actually, that was one of the facets that we were talking about when we were first discussing the idea of The Deep, which was we wanted to create. Tom and I had both read books in primary school of Tintin and Asterix, and they were the graphic novels available to us in the school libraries. But there was nothing available like that for kids that was made in Australia. And that was certainly one of the things that informed our decision to work on The Deep.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea that we never say where they're from, like we never give them a country of origin. We just say, if you identify with them based on who they are, then go for it. And they can be from anywhere.
What are their accents in the animation?
Canadian.
Right.
Because we had to start an international treaty with Canada to make the show.
Fair enough. They're North American Australians.
It's
anyway.
not like comics.
Yeah.
And as Australian creators, but on a kind of working global industries, do you feel a responsibility? Maybe we'll start with you, Nicola, to kind of tell Australian stories, or is it just this is a global industry and you just happen to be from Australia?
Unlike Tom, I haven't actually done a lot of Australian content, but I've been well aware of what my profile can provide here, and I'm very slowly but surely trying to sort of build sort of access points, like sort of finding the things that I can do with what I have built for myself for the sort of creators and the talent and the publishers that we have here. It's just going to take a while because it all takes time, and I don't have very much of that.
And then thinking about ideas around genre, we're here at a superhero conference, but of course comics can do anything and tell any kind of story. And Sutu, we talked about it earlier, you're not necessarily the biggest superhero fan. And maybe we could start with Sutu and make our way down the panel. But what kind of genres do you like to work in? What do you think works well in comics? What doesn't work quite so well in comics, perhaps?
Well, I suppose that, working with young people, like the superhero genre made my job super easy. So I could easily say, well, if you could have a superpower, what it would be? And kids love that question. They've been thinking about it every day. So they can answer it very quickly. But yeah, I suppose lately I've been moving more into documentary and stuff like that. And A lot of my work is going to be more informed by sort of personal experience. So telling Australian stories happens because I'm here, and reflecting on my own personal experiences or the people that I meet. I mean, I did just do a VR documentary set in the Menace Detention Centre that was based on interviews with 3 detainees there. And those interviews got smuggled out by the psychologist during the media blackout. And we also got one of the detainees managed to smuggle images of the actual detention centre. I got the guy to take a 360 shot, and then I painted that scene in VR. And it has a real comic aesthetic, but the story is so crazy. So yeah, I think like the potential for that format. I mean, that was a VR project, but still it was like heavily drawn on an illustrated aesthetic and drawing from comic experiences, but to tell such a story about the personal hardships of these people during a time that's, will be remembered as one of Australia's darkest chapters. It's like it really gives testimony to the strength of comic format. And having said that, like before that, I did a story about my grandfather suffering from dementia and coming to Australia as a refugee, and that one was a web comic, but it was nominated for Eisner, and as a result of that kind of access to that huge institution, which the Eisner Awards is, like that comic's been read about 1 million times, or over 1 million times, and it's taught in curriculums across the world at Columbia University and places like that. And I mean, I just did that comic in my spare time. I mean, probably spent $500 on it, but for independent artists to have access to an audience like that is just crazy. So that's a big thing.
Maybe Tom, the types of stories you're kind of doing mainly superheroes these, but you have, I mean, your breakout comic was again with Gestalt, the example, which was. I mean, it was a play first, and then it became a comic book, and it couldn't have been less superhero-y, and then that got you Star Wars. I'm not quite sure, how that
makes perfect sense.
Makes perfect sense.
It was about a briefcase on Flinders Street Station. Star Wars. It's the logical leap.
Of course. Yeah. But you obviously have that love for superheroes. You've talked about them playing with the toys of your childhood. But do you ever feel kind of you want to tell other types of stories, or are superheroes keep you going at the moment?
No, I do tell other stories, and there's other things going on. I've got a number of creator-owned books on the boil at the moment that aren't superhero related. But just as far as a creator trying to put Australian content into comics, I drop Australia in as often as I can. I put Flinders Street all the time. I like destroying Australian landmarks. I had Nauru the other day in an X-Men comic. Being basically the humanitarian crisis with agencies slamming the detention of mutants on Nauru and things like that. So I always like to put in little spankings, and I get away with it more on Injustice and things like that as well.
Yeah, because you had a Melbourne set Injustice story in which Superman lands in Melbourne, and there's a local superhero, an Australian superhero who says, Superman, you've no business here. And
that's right, named Mitchell Davies, who's one of the owners of All Star Comics. Yeah, and we broke his spine on the steps of Parliament.
I was just going to ask that. Yeah, are we supposed to read something into this? The Superman comes, touches down in Melbourne, he crushes the local hero.
He got better. More recently, Flash helped him with his rehabilitation.
Oh, well,
so he got to come back in Injustice too. Yeah.
Very nice.
So Galaxor, the Australian superhero. Yeah.
Very good. And then yourself, Wolf, genre, obviously, you've previously been horror and science fiction, but you've made kind of tentative steps into superheroes, which you told me 2 years ago you weren't really eager to do, but then I think Cleverman came along and changed your way of thinking.
I think the point that I made to you years ago was that I would only consider superheroes if there was a drastically different approach to them. And Cleverman certainly does that. It's more about an acknowledgement of history, of social commentary, of tackling political issues and social issues through the lens of science fiction. So that certainly bent my focus around to considering that for comics. But ordinarily, I think what I normally consider when it comes to comic storytelling is the emotional core, or the substance of a story. If I can read a script and put it aside and not think about it, then I'm not interested in it. You know, I want to be working with stories that continue beyond their page count. And in that sense, it doesn't matter if they are superhero, science fiction, horror, kids' stories, biography, you name it. It can be anything. As long as there's a poignancy that stays with me, then I'm interested.
And what about yourself, Nicola? You've moved from superheroes to cops and witches and things like that with black magic.
I think comics, like a lot of storytelling mediums, there are different stories that kind of are serviced better than in some mediums than in others. But I feel like comics kind of can really stretch the whole bounds, because, you know, while it's a privilege and a real honour to sort of be able to participate in the legacies of these sort of big name characters, you can tell really small, intimate stories that are very personal and very introspective. They don't need to be, you know, biff bang, you know, superhero stuff, which, you know, in this day and age is actually serviced incredibly well by movies, where they weren't 20 years ago, when the effects weren't nearly as good, and movie makers felt very embarrassed about making superhero movies, and so they're all in, you know, black leather rather than in colourful spandex. So I feel like comics is one of those mediums where you really do, as long as you sort of find the right style and the right pacing, you can really tell any story you want to tell.
So you think then the fact that we have superhero movies and TV shows, the burden isn't really on comics to be the sole place we can go to for those stories anymore, and perhaps freed up space for a few more genres to rise to the fore?
I don't know that the major superhero publishers would be so happy to hear that conversation. They're certainly sort of giving the audience what they need. Superhero publishing is sort of smaller now than it was, you know, 40 years ago. But what it has done is just sort of elevate the idea of comic books as a storytelling medium. You know, it doesn't necessarily bring audiences to superhero books. I'm sure it's doing a little bit. But really what it's doing is making the general audience aware of this source material medium, where there are all kinds of stories being created. You know, it's not just superheroes that are getting adapted into film and TV. It's all kinds of stories that are originating in comics, because it is that sort of small creative team. You can tell any kind of story with any kind of budget in any kind of time period. Some of those are getting turned into movies and film and TV shows as well. And they're, I feel like that is sort of elevating the status of comics as a storytelling medium.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking about, because you described how growing up you knew superheroes but not comics. So presumably you knew Wonder Woman from the TV show and things like that, but you weren't a comics reader. But I think we're seeing a kind of a greater range of comic readers now. Yeah,
I felt like the only comics that I was seeing in the news agency in the sort of 70s and early 80s, when I sort of became aware of them, were sort of very macho looking, sort of, you know, Hulk and Thor, drawn by Kirby, so sort of very blocky, very quite sort of exciting and aggressive, but it didn't feel like it was for me. And I wanted sort of, I loved superheroes, but I wanted it to be pretty. And on the odd occasion when I would see Wonder Woman on the cover of like a Justice League comic or something, she was kind of surrounded by all these people that I didn't know because they weren't in the Super Friends. And I just felt, it didn't feel like it was for me. And sort of during the 80s and the 90s, on the rare occasion that I went into a comic book store, I was just sort of overwhelmed by how much content there was, how familiar everybody in the space with all the material was. No one ever made me feel like they were gatekeeping, but it felt like I was an outsider. Where now I feel like especially with things like social media, it's kind of galvanized all these smaller pockets of fandom into quite a strong, powerful, into these sort of groups of strong, powerful voices. And so there are a lot more women in comics, there's a lot more LGBT characters in comics and readerships. And I feel like that is making just a sort of broader, more inclusive community that's much easier to invite yourself into.
Has that been your experience as a publisher, Wolfgang? Obviously, you go to the conventions a lot. Who reads your books? I mean, what different backgrounds do they come from? Are they all avid comic book readers, or do they come for specific titles?
No, if anything, I've found that we're getting a very diverse audience to our books at conventions, especially. I mean, I find that maybe about 5 to 10% of the people that pick up our books at conventions have never picked up a graphic novel before, or they've never read comics before. But they're there for something else, whether it be one of the media guests or just to cosplay as an anime character. But they'll find their way to the material that has a resonance for them. I couldn't give you statistics on demographics because I don't track that kind of stuff. I don't care. As long as there are people finding their way to our material, I'm happy. It doesn't matter who they are or where they're from.
I can tell you that the statistics of attendees at conventions now are generally more than 50% female.
I would agree based on the research we've done. And Tom, you took on 2 books that were probably traditionally male-led books, Wolverine and X-Men, and in both cases they had female leads. It was the Laura version of Wolverine, and then the Jean Grey-led X-Men. How has the response been, I imagine, varied? Amongst the long-standing fans and some of the newer fans that we're probably pointing to.
Yes, look, the response from X-Men fans is fantastic. The response from Marvel fans, from Jean Grey fans, from Laura fans is huge. It's also galvanized one of those fan groups of haters, and every single X-Men read that comes out. Yeah, right. Yes, every X-Men read that comes out, I'm a cultural Marxist propagandist. I don't know. I'm a social justice warrior and I deserve to die. And there's videos and rants and tens of thousands of people watching these things and coming at me. But that's good, because X-Men more than anything else is kind of my way of challenging what's happening in the world at the moment. And this is Jean Grey coming back from the dead at a time of Trump and going, oh, what? And social media. I wrote a whole section where she discovered Twitter for the first time, and she used a telekinesis to throw the phone into the sea, and she threw Twitter into the sea. But sadly, I had to delete that.
Where it belongs.
Timing. Yeah, where it belongs. Yes, but it is. I mean, it's Injustice and X-Men at the same time. I get to hit on so many different social issues and political issues and things that. Yes, it's all in the mutant metaphor, but apparently some people can see through my not so subtle wording.
But I mean, it makes you wonder about the people who are reading the book. Have they ever understood the thematic point of X-Men, which has always been about kind of progress and looking forward to the future? As say, people who criticise the Star Trek Discovery show, it's like,
yes,
isn't that sort of what it's about?
Yeah, the idea that X-Men has never been a book about social justice warriors, or that superheroes themselves aren't social justice warriors, is insane. I mean,
Superman, Captain America, Wonder Woman, they're all social justice warriors.
There is no argument you can make to people to say no. There's a reason they used to punch Nazis on the covers, and they did. You can't pretend they didn't.
But wouldn't the violence be an argument?
The violence is absolutely an argument.
I mean, that's the biggest dichotomy of all the superhero.
Yeah, well, I tend to. I mean, one of my first things, except for Injustice, where it is literally based on a fighting game, so it's the most violent thing I ever write. Is everywhere else I instantly come in and I try to find a way for things to be non-violent, and that's one of the things on X-Men. I mean, some of the things that are happening around them are violent, but all of their solutions are non-violent. The Deep, in particular, we have an actual policy of no violence. Laura, the first thing she did as Wolverine, the first issue was, the best there is at what you do, but what you do is not very nice. That's sort of the Wolverine mantra, is you kill people. Her first decision was to no longer kill people on that book, and it ran for 3 years with her not actually doing what Wolverine's supposed to do.
And then, so to thinking about the people who read your books, I mean, or the interactive comics, I mean, if 1 million people read that interactive comic, presumably some of those are not traditional comic book readers, but because they could get to this comic through the web or however they can buy it, you must have a very wide range of readers. What has kind of the response been to some of your books or your stories?
Yeah, I suppose that one in particular, like I can't imagine, I'm not sure of like the demographics of it, but I mean the subject matter isn't like a popular, you know, it's about an old man suffering from dementia, it's not pop culture. I suppose it caught the interest because it was using interesting mechanisms. So as you scrolled down through the story as well, that would sort of unfold the story and animate it a little bit. Because the story is about dementia and losing your memory and losing the memories of the war and that generation that's connected to that. But if you tried to scroll back up, all of those memories have been faded away, so you could only really read the story once. So that was kind of, people were like, oh, that's clever, you know, so that, and they would retweet or whatever. So that was kind of like a kind of a novelty as well that was helping for people to share it and be interested in it. And a lot of academics sort of support around that, and showing it in storytelling, education in general, not specifically related to comics. So yeah, I think like most of my work is for a general public, I suppose. Mm-hmm. I find more recently, like as I move into sort of virtual reality space, where the entry point to access the technology is really high. Like it's so expensive to buy VR gear. So if we make a story, like we've been doing a few social impact stories, and the thing is about VR especially is with a story like Inside Manor. So I did a story about a young US soldier that suffered from PTSD coming back from Iraq. It's like when you put someone into the VR, they're really immersed, so there's no looking at your phone and being distracted. You're in this space, and it's quite an intimate setting. I wanted the PTSD one to almost feel like you're in a confession booth with this guy, because he's telling a really emotional, powerful story about himself. So I think like when you can give someone that experience, and what we've been trying to do is get that headset on really powerful influential people. Like we're using like the limited access to that stuff, but if we can get that headset onto someone that actually could make a difference. And so it's been touring with veterans organisations across America and getting it on the headset of like key politicians that are pushing more support for veterans and stuff like that. So, and a fine example of the VR storytelling, one of our finest artists, Lynette Walworth, I mean, she got her story called Collisions on the headsets of like 60 leaders at a UN convention, and that was a story about nuclear bomb tests in the desert and its effect on Aboriginal people there. And that was at a time when they was ratifying nuclear weapons, and that was a really important timing, like really strategic timing to get a really powerful story onto into the heads of these people that actually decide our future in relation to nuclear weapons and stuff like that.
Very cool. And because we talked earlier, you and I, about your approach to VR is kind of there's a comic book style to the images, and there's kind of there's almost like a graphic simplicity that comes with comics that allows complex issues to be distilled in a way that makes them a little bit more digestible. Do you think in that way comics and VR related to that can make those complex issues more relatable? Maybe Sue too, if you want to start with that one.
I think like I mean, when I did my grandfather's story, like it was a real nod to the sort of Art Spiegelman approach of like drawing something like Mouse, where he was drawing a comic book with like telling the story about Nazis and the Holocaust, but doing it in the most basic illustration format. And by choosing that aesthetic, he was basically dehumanizing people by limiting them to just like minimal lines. And then not only that, representing them as cats and mice. It's like taking away their humanity through their representation in the story. It's like, it's just such a powerful concept, and, you know, 5 pages into that comic, you're bawling your eyes out and wondering what's wrong with yourself. And then you realise, like, wow, like, this is hitting me on so many different levels. This is, the whole aesthetic is this spear right now. And I felt like the same thing with Menace. I just deliberately drew it as a 2D aesthetic, but then when you put on the VR headset and you realise that you can actually walk into this 2D space, and suddenly it's 3-dimensional, because what happened with the detainees on Menace is they got their names taken off them. They're just given numbers. So the whole like security prison infrastructure was trying to take away their identities, and then it's like slowly through the story they're getting their names back, they're getting their 3 dimensions back, when they'd just been kind of stripped away to a 2-dimensional character.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about comics, is that they can, you know, take those kind of those concepts and just make them a bit more digestible, perhaps. What was interesting about your work on particularly Wonder Woman, Nicola, was that was a character who had become very simplified, particularly the art style had become very simplified, in particularly the 90s, the kind of hypersexualized one. And your art style seemed to be a bit more, if not fully realistic, but it was kind of more realist, I think. And what was your approach to Wonder Woman and trying to render her in a way that was superheroic, but also perhaps credible?
Right. Well, when we came to Wonder Woman, it was one of those projects that Greg and I had sort of been theoretically talking about, Greg Rucker, the writer, and I had been theoretically talking about for about a decade. And if the opportunity had come at any other point during that decade, I would have picked a slightly different style. But because it was happening in her 75th year, and the movie was coming up, and there was sort of a bit more of an awareness and a push to sort of make sure that there were some all ages books available. I had said, look, I want to do something that I haven't been doing. I've been slowly but surely getting grittier and darker with my work at DC Comics, slightly changing my style from title to title. And then I've just spent the last year painting in black and white for Black Magic. So when it was coming back to Wonder Woman, I just said I want my line work to be really simple and really clean, and I want it to be bright. I want it to look like it could be an all-ages book, but I don't want to dumb it down. And that in itself just sort of gave us some sort of storytelling flexibility. It meant that we could throw some borderline stupid things in there. Like I sort of campaigned to get the Invisible Jet included, because as ridiculous as it is, it's one of my favourites. But it also meant there was one particular panel where Steve Trevor is looking at Diana with a lot of affection. He's falling deeply in love. And I said, I'm really tempted to just draw love hearts around his head, like I'm in the middle of a manga. And Greg just started laughing and said, do it, do it. And if I was drawing in the same style as I had been drawing Earth 2, I couldn't have got away with something as kind of goofy as that.
I would have said, do it, do it.
Do it.
I mean, that year, kind of 2016, all coincided with also she was made the UN ambassador for women and girls, and you provided the art for that as well.
I did.
And that was a tenure that was cut short.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about that? Or is it still too raw?
No, it was just really disappointing, that's all, because it was... so Wonder Woman, and this had been building for close to a year, and I think it was in the final 7 months that I was brought on board to do the key art for it, which is this piece. Is it on the thing?
It is, yeah, it's there.
So very simple job, but I think they wanted a female artist to do it. And the point was Wonder Woman was going to be an honorary ambassador, and the point of an honorary ambassador is usually sort of allocated to fictional characters, because fictional characters can be a little more universal and a little less political, and they're very accessible to kids. And the point of Wonder Woman being an ambassador was for women and girls around the world. And so we were very conscious of, she's got an outfit that reveals quite a bit of skin, so let's cover up as much skin as possible. So I was sort of draping stuff around and making her skirt longer and making her boots a little higher and showing as little skin as possible, making her look like she had a nice smile, but it couldn't be an open mouth smile. It was just this, I've never negotiated so much over so little, you know, surface area. And as she was going through the ceremony, there was a lot of women who were signing a protest about her being a representative, because there should be a real life woman who can fulfill this role, and there must be a better example than Wonder Woman. And I found that disappointing personally, because I think Wonder Woman is exactly what they need. And the example that they were using as inappropriate for children was like 40-year-old TV version of Wonder Woman, who was in the room. It just sort of seemed like a really disappointing argument. And once it was taken away, I ended up writing a piece for The Guardian, sort of expressing a little more fully why I thought it was a shame. And 6 months later, when the film came out, Wonder Woman's whole sort of public profile shifted from being out of date and out of fashion to incredibly zeitgeisty.
So they kind of missed an opportunity.
They kind of really missed an opportunity, and I think it's a shame, because it was women who consider themselves feminists that were campaigning against a character that was created as a feminist character and had, through second wave feminism, sort of been a major representative, and has always been a political character. So it was kind of disappointing.
Yeah, it did seem like that they were kind of honing in on a very particular version of the character, who had a 75-year publication history that was perhaps out of sync with what she was today and what she was at her best.
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of missed the point.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking, because I know we'll have a few budding comic creators in the room, talk about how, and this question always comes up, and we talked about earlier today, Wolf, how to actually get into the industry. And Tom, I know you've got kind of a good story about how you got into the industry, and Wolf, maybe you might then talk about, from a publisher's perspective, what you're looking for. Go on, Tom, you go first. I love how you're kind of, your roots.
My story,
my
tale. You've probably all heard it. You've all seen me. So I dropped out of school. I became a childcare worker. I became a professional juggler. I used to eat fire and juggle knives over Megan, who's sitting over there, out on Burke Street and down at Fed Square. No, not Fed Square, Southgate. And then I also wrote plays, and I was in musicals, and I wrote a play about a briefcase on Flinders Street Station, and then a guy called Colin Wilson, who's one of the greatest artists in the world, who also lives in Melbourne. I approached him and asked him to do it, and he kind of said yes. Actually, there's more stuff to it, but we're out of time. And eventually he said yes. I got page after page after page, and then I woke Megan at like 1 a.m. and said, I'm sorry, I'm going to be a comic book writer. And that one comic got me a job writing Star Wars. It was about a briefcase on Flinders Street Station. It represented terrorism and racism and the rest of it, and written after the London bombing. And for some reason, Star Wars people saw that and went, yes. Yeah. But it isn't, I mean, that is the simplified story, but also, and Nicola will say this as well, it's also, that was the first step, but then going to San Diego, meeting editors, drinking beer with them, chatting into the wee hours, emailing and hassling, and just writing my ass off every single night forever is a huge part of that. So my first break was really because I did something with Colin Wilson, and he's amazing. Can
I expand on that a little bit?
Sure.
Because there was definitely some gatekeeping going on when Tom first started to find or to look for somebody to work with on this comic. And do you mind if I talk about this?
Go for it.
Yeah. There were Australian comic forums where Tom had naively said, hey, I've got this play or the script that I've written. I'm looking for an artist. And there was so much hatred and vilification that he would have the audacity as a potentially new writer to ask that kind of question of the Australian comics community. And by Australian comics community, I'm talking about those that were either wanting to make comics or wanting to think they could one day possibly, potentially make comics. and therefore somebody reaching out to try and do something was obviously very alien as a concept to them. Obviously it worked out because Colin Wilson was on these forums and defended Tom.
He said, "Leave him alone, guys. Do you want to have a coffee?"
Yeah.
And I did.
As a prime example of somebody being actually human as opposed to...
I will say too, and then this guy published it. Yeah.
There is that.
That's the big bit.
That's the next bit I was coming to, actually, because the very first convention that I exhibited with Gestalt at, which was in Melbourne back in, I think, 2008. And I'd flown across. I was horrendously jet-lagged, tired, slightly hungover because I was staying with people who were drinking a lot, and I was one of them. And
they had booze in their booth. I mean, no, they didn't.
It wasn't mine. Anyway, so Tom actually came up to the booth with another guy, and they had a camera, and they were doing interviews. And they interviewed me, talking about comics, about what it was like to be at this convention, and it all went quite well, and we kind of clicked. I think I swore on camera, and he gave me this funny look, like, "You're not supposed to do that, man." And I learnt that it didn't really matter anyway. But
Tom's always judging me for swearing.
Yeah,
he's such a prude.
I once made Nicola draw a little boy in San Diego, a Superman, for swearing in front of him. Yeah. She did it. It's good.
I owe a lot more.
So after this, this conversation, this interview, we've broken down professional barriers, etc. And he says, "Oh yeah, and I don't know if you'd be interested, but I'm also a writer, and I've got this set of stories that you might like to take a look at." And I thought, "You fucker." We'd gotten on well, and I said, "Yes, look, I'll look over them. That's fine. Leave them with me." And I think it was the following week that I got in touch with Tom via Skype and said, "Look, I think of these 3 stories, there's one that really stands out that I'd like to do something with." And that was The Example, which featured artwork by the ever-human Colin Wilson. So publishing that, I don't know, I guess I can claim that I discovered Tom Taylor.
Thanks for discovering me.
And you can get The Example downstairs in the ACMI bookstore. So
there you go.
Plug for everyone. But I think what would be interesting for some of the guys here is, because that's one route, and there seems to be no one story. There are so many different stories for how people get into comics. But maybe from your own perspective, Wolfgang, how do you come by the different creative teams who've worked?
Okay, I think the most important thing, and this is something that'll get espoused on social media all the time. Anytime anybody says to an established creator, "How do I break into comics?" It's like, make comics, and that's a wonderful thing for them to be able to say. But it's not that easy for people who don't know what they're doing. And by the way, if you look at somebody like Tom, who went through that process of, "I've got a script, can I get an artist?" No. Actually, yes. And then finding people to present it to, and that approach. So if you're not actually making comics already, find your way to making them if you want to be doing it. And by that, it's not going to be an easy process. You need to work out, if you're a writer, how to write a script. So look at the comics that you're enjoying reading, try to deconstruct and break down what it is you enjoy. Even look at mimicking some of those techniques and practices until you can find your own voice. Then find your way to artists. And you can find your way to artists through social media, through conventions, just through naively asking online and wading through a bunch of hate. And have persistence. Unless you're dedicated to it and absolutely committed to it, the odds are you're going to come up against criticism that you really don't want and may not be able to handle. I was once on a panel where one of the creators I was working with, one of the questions from the audience, I think, was, how do you keep working in comics if you find it a bit hard? And his response was just...
You don't.
Just don't. Don't even bother. Unless you've got it in your blood, you may as well just give up now. And I thought, yeah, there's probably a message there. It's a bit harsh.
But it's true.
But it's true, yes.
Yeah. None of us get anywhere without running that sort of trial by fire gauntlet. It is very easy for us to say, well, you've just got to make comics, and what does one do with that information? But that's kind of part of your personal learning process, is how do I make that happen? Because it kind of tests your resolve, it tests your ability to, and your determination, as well as testing your talent. It kind of doesn't really matter how talented you are if you don't have the focus and drive to get there.
Yeah, and one of the most important things that I think I could probably say is that start small. You know, if you are wanting to work in comics and you're going to make a comic, make a short one to start with, so you can actually better understand your approach to the storytelling. You can showcase your skills and your abilities to other creators, other writers, other artists, editors, and it will show that there is a commitment that you have to actually tell a story. Because a lot of what I hear at conventions are people who want to make comics, and by that, they think it's easy, and they want what they perceive as the glory of making comics. And
they want the result that's 10 years later without doing the 10 years to get there. And those 10 years to get there are really hard, but you got to get there.
And it's also, it's not just make comics. You also have to make good comics. Like, there's lots of people making comics. There's lots of appalling comics. Like, there seems to be this idea that comics as a genre is one thing from the outside looking in. We hear stories all the time about filmmakers and animators and directors and stuff who come to comic book people and say, hey, I want to make a graphic novel just so I can make a franchise. And it's never going to happen. It's never going to happen. You need, comics is its own language, and you need to understand it. And for that, you need to practice. And you are not going to start with something amazing to begin with. You need to practice. I said earlier that I was a professional juggler. I stood in a park for 2 years and I dropped things until I could juggle fire over people without killing them. And learning to write comics was exactly the same. It was something that I built up over time. My first work wasn't what I'm doing now. My voice wasn't what it is now. It was basically it was basically just Aaron Sorkin, let's be honest. I just watched a lot of West Wing and I wrote kind of like him. And then you move to somewhere else. So yes, make comics and make them small. Do a 5-page comic, do a 10-page comic, but then don't...
And do a lot of those before you move on to something bigger.
That's right. Don't just hold on to your best ideas. Don't think this is the greatest thing in the world, so I'm going to cherish it where no one will ever see it or read it. Let it out and then make something else, and your next idea will be better.
And learn from mistakes.
Yeah, and criticism. Just accept it's going to come. And yes, and don't take it too seriously unless it's right. Find someone you trust. Yeah. That's really important. I have a first reader. I have someone who's read every single thing I've written since I was 16 years old, and she reads everything and then tells me when I'm bad or when I'm wrong or when something could be better. And having someone that you trust that much that you're not going to be insulted by is incredibly important.
Well, I have lots more questions, but I suspect you guys do too. So I think we've got about 20 minutes or so left. Is there roving mics somewhere?
There.
Oh, there you go. If anyone has a question, throw up a hand, or I can keep going for a moment. Can't fully see. Any questions?
There's one just
there's one right at the back. You just passed it, Ewan.
This fellow over here.
Sorry, quick question just for Stuart. How can we see the detention center VR?
It's on. It was actually downstairs in Screenworlds, but we just put the superheroes one in there. But it's on the SBS VR app. So and it exists on there as a 360 video. So even if you can get like a Samsung Gear, like a Samsung phone, and put it into a Samsung Gear headset and access the SBS VR app that way. I think it's also on YouTube, so if you just search Inside Menace VR on the internet, you'll get to the YouTube page, and then you can put your phone into like a cardboard, and then press the little cardboard icon in the corner of the YouTube, and that will put you in there. So it was on there for free, both platforms for free.
Great, thank you.
There's one over here somewhere. Is there? Yeah.
Thank you. Tom mentioned the idea of being able to play with like the best toy box in the world and the idea of the kind of unconstrained scale that you can work with. But I'm wondering whether or not what you all think about the idea of comics as a place to push back against that kind of blockbusterization of the scale of stories and using it as a place to tell small-scale stories where readers can really identify with characters. We had a panel just before this which was talking about the idea of secret identities are kind of disappearing in the MCU because they're not necessarily required because of the scale of the stories. So I was just wondering what your thoughts were on that idea.
I think comics can be anything. It is that simple. Isn't it what Suchu's doing? You read any other books by Gestalt. You read Black Magic. Comics can be anything. There is this idea. Yes, it's capable of the blockbuster, and it's inspired the blockbuster, and that's why the MCU runs the entire pop culture world right now, because of the comics that they came from. But you can tell any story. You know, we talked about the example. That's just two people standing on Flint Street Station and a briefcase for 11 pages. And that is the beauty of comics. It can be anything.
And when you're sort of talking about those small stories for the big scale characters, like sort of, intimate stories for the superheroes, there is so much content that's created. Each character generally has like a 20 to 22 page book coming out once a month, for decades and decades and decades. And the bigger the character, the more likely they're to have multiple books or appear in multiple books. And there are always moments, and sometimes full issues, where they're quite sort of small scale, intimate scenes. So there are opportunities there, but they're possibly going to be overwhelmed from time to time by, the big splashy thing. But certainly quite a lot of the content that's coming out from writers like Tom King, who's sort of doing a lot of sort of intimate stories with these iconic characters. They're getting a lot of publicity and they're making pretty big sales.
And just even thinking about that kind of the idea of you can do smaller stuff and more grounded stuff in superheroes. And I mean, superheroes work because the MCU notwithstanding, they have secret identity. So that kind of roots them in the everyday, and then the sort of the joy is seeing them perhaps become the superhero. But recently we had kind of Bill Maher following Stan Lee's death in the US saying, basically blaming comic books and superheroes for the rise of Trump because it's an escapist fantasy that kind of for people who can't hack the real world. Thoughts?
He's a wanker.
I just think sometimes he was speaking about something of which he knows little.
Yeah, he clearly didn't seem to know, because he was conflating comics with superheroes, movies with the comics. Talk about America's the only country that has comics, while you could point to France or Japan or any number of countries around the world where comics are probably more prominent than they are.
I think his statement basically shows what happened. I think that was ignorance on a pedestal right there, and that is what's behind a lot of these movements. That's what's behind Brexit. That is, it is people either being lied to or not understanding things, or and it went down really well. Yeah, I really appreciated those comments.
I had a response to this sort of small stories question before. It was just actually a story that I read, just came to mind, and it was the characters in the story were teeth, and they were drawn as little teeth that were talking to each other. But then you find out that they're actually the teeth that had survived the Hiroshima bombing, and it's because the teeth were found, and that was how they were identifying people. And you're just like, holy shit, like that's a deep. Suddenly you're discovering the story of these people whose lives were lost, but it was drawn in such a. It was a Japanese guy that did it, and it was drawn in such a sort of comical kids sort of access. The character, they were really, like a tooth that you'd expect to see on a dentist sign or something. Really friendly, welcoming teeth.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of another book called Lives, which is illustrated by the Philback brothers, who are cowboys who live in Las Vegas. But this was a book that came out a few years ago, and as you're reading through it, and it's just about these intimate moments within family and co-workers and people heading to work and getting their kids to school, and they're all sort of en route somewhere throughout the story, and you're reading it, and it's sort of you're feeling something, and you're empathizing with the characters in these moments, And the final page is the reveal that they're all going to work at the World Trade Center on 9/11. And that was profoundly moving.
Yeah.
But you didn't expect that to be the climax for the story, and it just lulled you into the sense of relating to the characters, and suddenly you're aware of what's about to happen.
Yeah, small stories on a grand scale.
Yeah.
I mean, what comics are really good at is, because it is chosen moments. You talked about already, what do you encapsulate, what do you not. And as soon as you encapsulate a moment, it kind of is given this greater significance. So if it's a smaller moment, which you particularly see in things like manga and stuff like that, where they kind of focus on smaller moments, it's amplified in a way that's, so it doesn't always have to be the big leveling punch or the buildings toppling like dominoes. Sometimes it can just be a look. And if it's given like the double page spread that was once afforded the punch up, it kind of has an impact that it wouldn't have on the screen, where it goes by in the blink of an eye. Now, I think you had a question down here, and keep throwing your hands up if you have questions, but we'll take one here anyway. Or here, right down
over here.
Here and here. Okay, right there. Do you want to just yell it out, Naya? Yeah, just yell it out. We'll repeat it for everyone else. Go for it now.
Well, it helps that I'm working with an American writer, that he's kind of balancing things out. But certainly over the last 15 years in particular, and it's certainly not just through comics, but hearing sort of Australian terms like no worries sort of filter into sort of just general American speak has been very interesting, hearing sort of little bits and pieces like that. But like, I've worked almost entirely with American writers. They're kind of handling the language. I do find myself from time to time sort of going, what season are we, where are we? Like, what you know, but I'm constantly doing that anyway on a practical sense, because I draw all of my roughs on the back of the page in reverse. So I'm already kind of used to juggling the opposite of everything in my head, and sometimes I do get it wrong, you know. I'm sort of making people who are right-handed hold things in their left hand, vice versa. Sometimes I'm, you know, I like to sort of put, if there's writing in the art rather than a speech bubble on top of the art, I like to do it myself rather than leave it for the letter. I want it to feel like it's integrated. And so I've become quite proficient at writing things backwards. And sometimes, especially doing something like Superman's logo, which isn't reversible, I can forget which way is the right way because I'm so used to seeing it both ways. And sometimes I will be doing the finished art and I've drawn it backwards.
It's a
and
bizarre
I haven't
story.
realised.
Hooray!
Yeah, it's suddenly bizarre, yeah. Not to publication, because someone will catch it along the way. It's usually I will catch it the next day when I look at it fresh and just be like, oh, that's wrong. Whoops.
I was doing lettering on Spider-Man last night, and like it happens constantly. And I always think I've got it all right. I've been writing American comics for 10 years, but they changed washing to laundry. They changed housemate to roommate, like things like that. Like they don't. You don't call each other housemates. No. Okay. So yeah, little things like that.
Yeah.
I think there's mics going around, but we can't see you. But you just start talking into the mic.
Is it on? Is it on?
Sure. I think there's a mic out there.
Someone's got a mic.
Yeah, go for it.
Tom, in terms of learning the scripting process, in addition to reading lots of comics and writing lots of your own, did you read lots of comic scripts as well, or did you read film scripts or TV scripts, anything like that?
No. No, I just read comics, and I worked out how I'd want to write them. And then, because I was working with someone like Colin, I often found, so we started on Star Wars together, and I'd write something, and he'd draw about a quarter of it, and I'd be like, what about, you know, that other guy who talks, or that the X-Wing that flies into the... He's like, no, I didn't get that far. You need to write less. So Colin, being a curmudgeon, really helped me. It's like, basically, I try to think of a panel description kind of like a tweet. Like, you need to be incredibly succinct and get across every idea that you want to get across to the writer in as short as short a space as you can, and really, really get it across well, because you need to be able to see that on the page. You can't write like Alan Moore and expect a writer to understand everything that's been written.
Do not write like Alan Moore.
Yeah, yeah, just as a rule.
Because even Dave Gibbons wouldn't read those scripts. His wife would read the scripts, and she would highlight, "That's important."
Yeah.
That's important. This is all one panel. As an artist who has worked now with dozens of writers, I can tell you with quite confidence that every writer has their own style, has their own technique. Some people put in very little information in their panel descriptions. Some will put in sort of a lot of tonal information because they want to sort of convey the mood to you as the artist. That's actually really useful. You don't want to be burying the artist in loads of detail, because it then becomes very hard to know what is important. Because if, that lamp that's in the background that you described in like a 3-page description of what a room should look like is the actual object that, killed Professor what's-his-name in the library, but you don't know that at the beginning.
Was that Chekhov's lamp?
You don't know. Sorry?
Chekhov's lamp.
Yes, Chekhov's lamp. You don't know that it's important, so you don't know to highlight it early enough. So just give them the information that they need, and that's it, because that's our job.
Yep, and do look at some scripts. Do look at, particularly if you've got favourite writers. Most writers have scripts examples on there. Take a look, but don't be too beholden to them. It is more about just understanding the medium backwards. If you love the medium and you can write something that you like, then hopefully other people will like it too, unless you're a total freak.
I think it's so important to seek out the masters too, and try to understand why they are.
Yeah.
Like when you are going through, like from a visual point of view, like there's that economy of both text and the visual image, and then it's like all of those panels, like Nicole was saying, is like so strategically calculated or measured alongside the wording, and suddenly if you've got your point of view at the top of the forest and the girl is in the middle on the horse going into this space, it just is screaming vulnerability, like someone's going to get her, and then suddenly you realise you don't need any words at that moment.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I think that's the beautiful thing that I keep loving discovering, like when people like invent those techniques, those cinematic views that have gone on to influence like cinematography and films and stuff so much as well. It's like, and then probably the reason why so many comic books get adapted into these formats, because it's like just an incredible rich storyboard for these films that makes it too easy for all the big heads to imagine what it's going to look like.
Yeah,
for sure.
I will say too, one great thing about being a writer when you know you've nailed it. I just did a story with an Indonesian woman called Yasmin Putri. It was set at Christmas time in post-apocalyptic times. And it was a story that, I'll spoil it for you, sorry, where it turns out a woman who discovers a child is actually Supergirl. And once she gets to the top of a radioactive cloud, she climbs a mountain and she becomes empowered again. And it turns into an asylum seeker story, and they go off to another world together in very difficult circumstances. But I got the pages in for that, and the story worked 100% without any words. Like, I looked at it and went, I just don't put them in there. That's when you know as a writer and when you've got an incredible artist like that, the story should work because you've given them every emotion you want on the page. You've explained every beat, and to see it fold out like that and go, publish this without words, it'd be perfect. You've done well.
Yeah, like with making films, you get a final pass at the writing in the edit. You get to sort of slightly change the story in the edit. You have the same with comics. When you're doing that final lettering pass, once there's letters on the art, you can see what you need and what you don't need. I've spent a lot of time working with Greg over the last few years, and he is more likely to say, we don't need that dialogue, we don't need that dialogue, we don't need that dialogue, because the storytelling is there in the art.
I think that that idea of the silent comic book, or the comic book without words. It's like even that as a concept or as a challenge for an artist is really cool. Like, okay, I'm going to not use words here right from the get-go. I had to adapt like a Aboriginal story, and in the like traditional Aboriginal storytelling, the narrator can switch from being the man by the fire to the tree that's watching the man, to the wind that blows up his neck, to an earwig that's chewing on the foot of a duck in the pond. Like that was one of the narrators at one point. I was like, whoa, like this just doesn't fit into my understanding of storytelling at all, but this is so cool. So yeah, that was a really interesting experience.
Yeah, I think choosing to show what's happening rather than to need to state or to say it is definitely one of comics' greatest strengths. I mean, we published a wordless graphic novel called Vowels, which was written and illustrated by our art director, and was actually one of the reasons why Gestalt came into existence. Without wanting to go off on too big a tangent, I was working in a video library back when they were a thing, and Sky Ogden, who helped co-found Gestalt, was a customer. And I was always working on my laptop, and he came in one day and just said, what are you doing on that? Because he was a fairly forward kind of guy. And said, I'm just, I'm writing comic scripts, I'm doing this, doing that. Because I was doing corporate comic strips for editorial magazines, and it was fucking killing me. I know, right? Yikes. Anyway, he came back with a folio quite excited. I said, I've been doing this, I'm working on, these are my comic pages, and if you're working on writing and doing this other stuff, maybe we can work together. He showed me one chapter of Vowels, which he had worked on, and it was only one chapter that existed at that point, and it was E, the second chapter. And from that point on, I was absolutely dedicated to trying to find a way to help him get that produced and out to an audience. And that was the second book that we published.
Nice. That's cool. I think we have a mic here, and keep throwing up your hands.
I was actually going to ask about script formats, but I feel like we sort of covered that ground now. So the backup question...
Panel, repeat.
Yeah, the backup question, I guess, is just really simple. Who are you guys reading at the moment? What writers and artists do you admire out there at the moment in the comic world?
There's a German-based creator called Andreas, and he's produced a series called Rourke that definitely informs my aesthetic, and I enjoy all his work. I once read one of his stories, and I thought, how many panels are on that page? And it turned out there were 37.
Holy shit.
I know, right?
That's giving me conniptions.
Yeah. But he made it work. And it didn't register me as I was reading it that there were so many. It was only afterwards, as I looked back at it before turning the page, I went, just a second. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. And beyond that, another European creator called Johann Svar, who did a book called The Rabbi's Cat. Absolutely love pretty much everything he's done.
I'm not reading a lot of comics at the moment. I just don't get a lot of time. I flip through and I see stuff online, but... my job kind of takes about 10 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so once I'm done, I don't want to pick up a comic book. I tend to sort of binge a whole bunch whenever I've got a holiday coming up. I'll sort of take a whole bunch away with me and read through them then. So I'm usually a couple of years behind.
I have a giant stack next to my I have my shame pile, and we moved in a bookshelf to become my shame shelves into our bedroom, and yeah, so I'm failing, but I've just bought a Solar, I just bought Death and Glory, Justice League. I like everybody in the world, I'm reading Saga, and it's incredible, and it's always incredible. Fiona Staples is amazing. Yeah. What else am I reading? I read everything that Kelly Thompson writes because she's hilarious and entertaining and beautiful, and she sends me everything as well before it comes out, and my 13-year-old son reads it. He's her favourite author. I'm his second favourite. And there's a whole lot I'm reading, and I tend to pick up as much as I can. I think Tom King's a genius. He hates hearing it, but it's true. Scott Snyder's great. Gail Simone's always amazing.
I was just going to say, artist-wise, Mitch Turatz and Clay Mann.
Clay Mann?
In particular.
What a freak.
I am a little bit obsessed.
He's so pretty
because,
too.
his style is so sort of grand and superheroic, but it's really realistic and intimate. And yeah, I look at his work and just think, you asshole.
Yeah.
Because he looks like the missing Hemsworth brother.
And he's got a twin brother who also looks like the missing Hemsworth brother.
Screw them.
Yeah, both those man boys. They're ridiculous. Yeah, he's just, so all those unbelievably godly looking guys he's drawing, it's just him. Yeah.
I'll just drop one comic in there that I read recently that was amazing, Upgrade Soul by Ezra Clayton Daniels. And yeah, it will surprise you. It's about some old people that decide they're going to enlist themselves into some experimental scientific study to reverse aging, I guess, in a way. But it doesn't go right. And it's just like so many amazing questions about sort of mortality. And it's just done really beautifully. It won a bunch of awards in the States. And I know Ezra, so I'm a bit biased, but but it's a truly beautiful thing, so check that one out.
Cool. Have we time, Ewan, for more questions? Is there a hand somewhere?
Who wants to be last?
Oh, right there.
Pow.
Go you.
There was a leap.
What are your individual attitudes about the trend that industries... What are your individual...
Yep.
I think you were doing better before the microphone. Yeah.
Digital transformation of the industry in terms of digital distribution and digital reception, digital reading, and its impact on the narrative arc and also the aesthetic?
That's a good question.
Look, I think, like Wolf was saying earlier, I don't care how people read our books so long as they're reading. Writing Injustice, because that was the biggest selling digital comic in the world, we had to change the storytelling slightly so that each page was actually 2 pages. And for an artist, that's incredibly frustrating to have to work on that sort of landscape iPad shape, although this guy knows a lot more about that. But you do change your storytelling knowing that instead of being able to, you know, in comics, you can only surprise people on every even page when they turn the page. On an iPad, you can actually surprise people every half a page, which means your storytelling can be faster and you can have more reveals, but then you also need to build up over 2 panels instead of over 6 or 5. So you do change it, but I don't care how people find comics so long as they find them.
I think it's inevitable that the sort of monthly floppies will eventually get replaced by just digital release. Certainly not yet, and certainly not at the big, you know, superhero companies. But slowly but surely that's going to be how people consume on a monthly, weekly basis. But I don't see trade paperbacks or hardbacks ever going out of style because people want the real thing. They want to be able to put it on their bookshelf. They want to be able to take it to conventions and get creators to sign it. I think it is evolving, but it's never going to obliterate old school completely.
No, DC have just announced, or they announced last year, that their trades are now selling, I think, slightly more than their monthlies for the first time ever.
Yeah.
Can I just add, like, sort of coming from the perspective of this new sort of emerging media of like digital interactive storytelling and stuff like that. I mean, we're kind of growing up in a generation of digital natives. Yep. So every young person that I show, like the digital comics, to sort of navigate through it, so without much thought and that sort of thing. But also for me, like I run an augmented reality company, and I did an augmented reality comic book where you hold your phone over the pages. So it was a companion piece, a digital app with a physical comic book, and you hold your phone over the page to expose a second layer of the narrative. So you're kind of constantly comparing, which is a stupid way to kind of read a book in a way. But
it's like witchcraft. It's amazing. It is.
But yeah, it had a very gimmicky, magical sort of quality about it. But what happened was, like, it was one of my like rare digital projects. Like all my digital projects for like the last decade just didn't make any money and didn't pay for themselves, and were just like labour of love most of the time. But this one just like went gangbusters and paid for itself, and people will not pay $3 for an app, but they will pay, you know, $20 for a book that has an app compendium sort of thing going on. So I thought that was really interesting from just like finally like getting paid. But yeah, the capability, like the possibilities of the sort of digital storytelling, especially with like the emergence of VR and AR and things like this. Like VR for me represents a whole revolution of spatial storytelling. The fact that I can stand inside VR and paint this environment. I'm standing inside my own artwork, which still kind of blows my mind. And I can walk around it and I can grab it in my hands and make it as big as the Statue of Liberty or put it down so it fits in a hole like this. And so I was like, there's like a whole new era of possibility there.
And because you're on the forefront of that, you're kind of learning all of these lessons for everybody else. You know, the fact that you're sort of realizing what people will pay for and what they won't pay for, that's the kind of experience that you don't get without trying. And the fact that you're making these sort of efforts and going out there and doing it and finding what works and what doesn't is going to be what the next generation of creators use as their template, because you've already done the experimenting and found what works and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's a good point as well, because it's created a demand on us to share those tools. So we
get paid for sharing those tools.
Yeah, well, we have launched a platform now. It's in a beta phase, ijackapp.com. You can try that out, and that will let you kind of I've tried to make it like the Twitter of AR for augmented reality, like the Twitter of augmented reality. In 3 steps, you can kind of make your art come to life. But with the hope that, to support artists to do that if they want to. It's like, yeah, and also to create new possibilities for artists and animators to collaborate, like, because animators especially, like, so much work goes into an animation and no one pays for them.
Yeah.
And it's like, but suddenly having it like combined with some physical stuff, which we've accepted over hundreds of years of paying for physical things. So it's interesting, like it doesn't have to be that way, but at least like it's something that you can know that there's a possibility there. It's really good.
Go you.
So on that kind of forward-looking note, I think we'll wrap up. We're going to be back here at 6 o'clock for the In Conversation that Nicola's going to host with Trina Robinson. That's going to be something special. And I think we're going to have a little bit of an informal signing. Well, I've announced it, so it's formal now. Signing of some of the books that are down in the bookstore, which all these guys are responsible for, following Trina's In Conversation out there in the kind of mezzanine area. That'll be about 7:30. But for now, join me in thanking our great panel, Nicholas, Scott, Wolfgang Bilsma, Tom Taylor, and Sue too. Thank you, guys.